This is just a little map of the European nations, the EU member states, and not all the member states do use the euro, of course. Like, for instance, the United Kingdom is a member of the European Union, but they don't use the euro. I wanted to interject that I always thought that a lot of this crisis that's coming up with the euro and the EU is planned. It's, in other words, using the Hegelian dialect. If you've never heard of the Hegelian dialect, it basically is a theory that, real succinctly and very briefly, even put it more brief, is that conflict produces change, and without conflict you can't have a change. You won't have a new outcome. So if you want to progress or digress or regress, going back or going forward, depending on how you look at it, to something different or more controls or more centralized controls in the European Union, you have to have conflict, you have to have crisis, or else it will not change. That's always what spurs things to change. This is an interesting quote, and let me just get on with the more official formula, and it can get more complex because the more complex something is, the more people turn off from it, so I want to keep it as simple as possible. And I don't like reading it complex either because it doesn't need to be. Hegelian dialect formula: A, thesis versus B, antithesis, equals C, synthesis, a new outcome. For example, if A, the thesis, my idea of freedom, conflicts with B, your idea of freedom, neither of us can be free until everybody agrees. And a lot of times that means you're agreeing under another set of rules that are completely different, and you might be a slave. The Soviet Union was based upon the Hegelian dialect, as is all Marxist writing. And a lot of it goes back, a lot of it is, with Nazism too. And I don't want to get into all these communism, Nazism stuff, but it's like people give up their freedoms basically in one way or another. And this succinctly says it. This is William Scheer. He quoted Georg Hegel in his Rise and Fall, like writing in the book The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I read this a couple times a long time ago, 1959, page 154. And the state has the right, supreme right, against the individual whose supreme duty is to be a member of the state. The individual's supreme duty is to be a member of the state. For the right of the world spirit is above special privileges. So the state is like the world spirit, and that's higher than anybody's special privileges. But obviously somebody controls a state, and that's the whole racket in one deal right there. This was an interesting quote, and it does support this idea that crisis is producing change. Jean Monnet, founding father of the European Union, in a letter to a friend, 30th of April 1952, European nations should be guided towards the superstate without their people understanding what is happening. This can be accomplished by successive steps, each disguised as having an economic purpose. Key word, economic purpose, but which will eventually and irreversibly lead to federation. So when you're seeing this economic crisis happening in Europe, recession and all this type of stuff, it is by design. That's my contention. The whole thing is by design, so people will accept what's given to them. You have to have crisis to bring about change. That's always been the thing. The European Declaration, this was like immediately before that letter, the year before, April 18th, 1951. Now, if you're a little superstitious about some of these April 18th, April 19th, April 20th dates, they have this occult connotation. I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not, because I don't like reading too much into that stuff. But basically, they talk a lot about peace, They always bring out this word about peace, nations working together. They put all these lofty goals. So obviously, I think that's just for the, just a sweeten up thing, so people will bite into it. But what's going to happen is, if you actually read this declaration, it's the whole thing was to create a true foundation for an organized Europe, you know, and that is the whole name of the game. In other words, this was far more than peace. It was actually about a supranational governing body that would be over all of Europe. And the only way they're going to cooperate is if they have such a crisis that they don't cooperate, they don't survive, or they're hurt extremely badly economically. So this was the Charter of the European Union and a Declaration of Interdependence, that Europe must be built on supranational democratic principles. Now, as far as the member states that came in a little later, like Portugal was one of them down here, and Greece was 1981. Portugal and Spain was both 1986. Mark Farber thinks that some of the nations might be expelled. That could very well be. I'm not sure about Greece, though, because of the symbology. But Italy, if Italy was expelled, since they're the third largest economic power in Europe, and now I know like people have different visions of Italy, and I don't want to, I have both types of Italian in me, but there's Northern Italian and Southern Italian, and I know most of the economic powerhouse that's in Italy is in Northern Italy. It's more like, the rest of Europe. If this was expelled from the EU, I don't think the EU would really survive in any type of strength that it is today. So I have some doubts about Italy being expelled from the EU. So I mean, if he's talking about nations to be expelled, I think it would be Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, possibly Spain, but probably Ireland and Portugal. Countries with the most amount of debt and fairly good sized populations. So, but I do think the main thesis of this is this deliberate crisis being pushed about, so there will be more centralized control over this entire area. I do not buy into what Lindsey Williams was told by this so-called retired oil CEO regarding that when a European euro falls apart, you got 3 weeks to get out of paper. I think it's smart to be out of government bonds because governments will default on debt, and I think Mark Farber's advice about equities are a better choice than bonds, because the larger companies will still survive even if the equities take a downturn temporarily for a while. They're not going to go to zero for the most part. The companies have a better chance of surviving than governments, because governments are spending themselves and they're going to default. And I think some of the information and some of the rumors out there is completely disinformation. I think what's going on here is the concept of the European Union. You could see it's been, formalized since 1951. Formalized. So this, that was, 6 years after the end of World War II. Tell me this wasn't in the works even in the 30s or well before that. It definitely was. It definitely was existing in think tanks. If anybody thinks that all these countries are going back to their individual currencies again, they're very wrong. And I think the smarter people that are telling all the people out there that they're going to all go back to their individual currencies again is totally flat out a disinformation agent themselves, because they do know better. This type of idea is not going away at all. It may change, and maybe it will be a Northern Europe and a Southern Europe. Well, maybe Italy might be, part of the Southern Europe then in that case. But the idea and concept of a euro and a European Union and a euro currency is definitely not going away. So if it falls apart, there might be a catastrophic change in the equities markets, the precious metals markets, or whatever like that. But as far as everything going into evaporation on paper, I think that is total disinformation. Just wanted to point that out, that this is occurring on purpose, and it's not like the elite are losing control. This is the way they're playing the game on purpose. They might lose control, but they are playing this game on purpose. This crisis is to produce change. It's the deliberate game.